So my name's Naomi Chapman. I'm the Principal Consultant for Strategy here at MPC. I'm going to be chairing today's conversation. Thank you all so much for choosing to spend your lunchtime attending today's event, and of course to the Clothworkers Company for supporting this whole event series. If this is your first one today, this is the fourth and final event in our series this year, but if you did miss those previous sessions, you can find recordings of events for trustees focused on AI, on becoming more adaptive and systemic, and on political influencing all over on our YouTube channel. So there really is something for everyone. And if those topics don't appeal to you, we also have a big back catalogue of events from previous years, all targeted at trustees, many on really perennial issues like embedding lived experience on your board. So we really do recommend you dive into the YouTube back catalogue. As this is the final event in this year's series, we're now getting started with planning future events and what we're going to do next year. So if there is something you'd love to see a webinar or training on in relation to governance, then please do let us know. This is kind of your time to influence what we prioritise next year. But anyway, today we're talking about achieving impact in a challenging financial context. In my work with charities on strategy development and implementation, this is a perennial conversation. How can we deliver more impact with less financial resources? How can we set long-term ambitious strategies amid a context of short-term funding cycles? And how can we think beyond our existing business models to deliver impact in different ways? It's really important that trustees are at the forefront of all of these conversations, both with an eye to the horizon to understand how our organisation's resources and the world around us might change, and to be thinking creatively and ambitiously about how organisations can respond to these changes. We know that the context for charities is really difficult, with many traditional sources of funding to the sector declining, but also there are new avenues for impact opening up and some great examples of impact occurring despite the sector landscape. What we think is most important is that trustees are having explicit and regular conversations about the financial context and position of our organisations and the options that exist for delivering impact. It's our responsibility as boards to identify challenges and oversee changes, but all too often we find these conversations are left until it's too late, rather than held proactively and continually as part of good governance. So we've got four great speakers today who are going to be talking about a range of different options available to organisations and the roles of trustees in stewarding these changes whilst maximising impact. But as a first step to understanding the financial context and positions of our organisations, I'd really recommend the Charity Commission's tool for checking your financial health, which will help you to understand both your responsibilities as trustees, but also will signpost you to support and guidance that will help you know what to do if you're not meeting those responsibilities or you identify an issue. So before we get started, I'm going to ask my colleague Rebecca to just launch a short poll, which has two questions, and will just help us to understand who's in the room today. So if you could take a moment just to fill out that poll when it pops up, and that would be really, really helpful in framing the conversation. Great, thank you, Rebecca. I can see people voting. Fantastic. So I think most people have voted now, just a few more responses coming through. So it's great to see that most of our audience are trustees or chair of trustees, a few staff who are here kind of understanding, I suppose, how they can support their boards to have these conversations and take some of this forward. Quite a mixed picture on the confidence of delivering impact in times of financial difficulty. Great that the majority do feel somewhat confident, but quite a spread across being kind of neither confident or unconfident or being quite unconfident. So hopefully through today's session, we can help boost your confidence and take that forwards. Great. So I think that's all of my kind of intro and preamble as chair, and I'll get on to our speakers who are much more interesting than I am. So our first speaker is Suan Rajkumar, who is Senior Associate at the law firm Bates Wells, where he works with charities, non-profits and businesses seeking to have a positive social impact. For keen attendees of these events, you'll remember Suan from our 2024 event on what trustees need to know about campaigning, and we're really lucky to have him with us again today to bring his expertise on charity governance, crisis management issues, and particularly mergers and spin-outs from a legal perspective. As well as his legal expertise, Suan brings his own experience as chair for bail for immigration detainees and trustee of the Community Action for Refugees and Asylum Seekers, CARAS. So, Suan, it would be great if you could kick us off with your perspective on kind of when monitoring financial difficulties, what are the duties of trustees and executives, and how do they differ?
Of course, thank you, and thank you for having me today. So that the starting point for trustees is that trustees have no overriding duty to advance the purposes of a charity for the public benefit, and the Commission sees that as six core duties, which I'll list now, but they're all listed in the Commission's guidance, which is pretty helpful, although there's a lot of it. So it sees those duties as ensuring your charity is carrying out its purposes for the public benefit, complying with your governing document and the law, acting in your charity's best interests, ensuring your charity is accountable, managing your charity's resources responsibly, which is the key one we'll be focusing on today, and acting with reasonable skill and care. And I thought it was helpful to highlight all six because as well as managing your charity's resources responsibly, acting with reasonable skill and care is really important. And that's kind of flexible threshold, which means that if you have a particular expertise, you'll be held to that standard, rather than the kind of more general standard. And so charities with legal expertise, or in this context, accounting expertise or financial expertise, are expected to bring that expertise to the board table. Whereas trustees without that experience will be held to kind of the appropriate standard by the Charity Commission if anything were to go wrong. Um, I thought I'd maybe talk a little bit more about trustees' duties and financial management as kind of charities enter difficult financial positions. Um, and there's a kind of different position, I think, for charities which have employed staff and those which don't. I'll focus mainly looking at kind of who's in the room on charities which do have employed staff teams, but I'll comment also on other charities, smaller charities maybe, which are entirely trustee run. For all charities, it's really important for the trustees to have a good knowledge and understanding of how the finances work, so that they can be accountable for and take responsibility for the continued viability of a charity and assure that its charitable activities continue. And that includes understanding how restricted funds work. That's particularly important if you're looking at financial difficulties and solvency issues, because you may well have cash in the bank or income which is restricted for particular purposes and therefore isn't actually available for the wider costs of the charity and doesn't impact the overall solvency position. For charities with staff teams, and particularly charities with finance staff, clearly there's a division of responsibility between trustees and the staff team and the executive if it's a large charity. And trustees will rely heavily on the staff team for the kind of day-to-day financial management, cash flow analysis, kind of really being on top of the detail. And in the normal course, trustees will, really lean heavily on the staff team and probably not be that close to the detail. But as charities enter financial difficulties or kind of start navigating trickier financial circumstances, it's important for trustees, certainly at least the treasurer, but probably all trustees, to have a better view of what's going on and be checking in more regularly with the staff team or the finance manager, whether that be through more regular board meetings, meetings of a finance subcommittee, or through the treasurer, just working more closely with the staff team. And kind of in a practical sense, that might be, as I say, more regular meetings. It might be more regularly produced cash flow updates and scenario planning, that kind of thing, so that the trustees can make informed choices. It's worth saying as well that the trustees' duty to further the interests of the charity switches at the point of insolvency, and suddenly at the point of insolvency becomes a duty to the creditors of the charity. And so that's really important when taking decisions. Obviously, trustees will be perfectly used to focusing on the best interests of the charity and framing every decision in that context. But that switches at the point of insolvency, and that's really important to understand. I could say more, I think, on trustees' duties, but I've been speaking for a little while, so maybe I'll pause there, Naomi.
No, it's a really helpful overview. Thank you so much for sharing. And maybe we'll say if you have particular questions about kind of trustee duties and practical ways that you can fulfill that duty as a trustee, then do pop them in the Q&A and we'll come back to that. The other question I just wanted to ask you, Suan, before we go to another speaker, is obviously a lot of your work is around mergers and spin-outs, and as you'll know from that, we're seeing more and more charities making the decision to merge and to take that forwards. I was wondering if you could share a bit for our audience today about when you think mergers are a good idea, and how trustees can keep impact front and centre as they navigate that legal process.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think merging or restructuring in any way, spinning out part of the organization or taking on part of another organization can be really helpful when thinking about the options on the table when you're in financial difficulties. Before I go into mergers, it's maybe just worth thinking briefly about some of the other options that you might look at. So when I was speaking earlier, I was talking about the practical reality of how you do keep on top of the changing financial position and how you can work with the staff team to do that and what the regulator would expect of you. Obviously, visibility is part of the challenge, but then being able to take informed decisions on the basis of that visibility is as important. Practically, trustees might explore, for example, whether you have discretionary expenditure that can be cut. You might look at your contract terms. You might think about your employee terms and whether staff can um, reduce their hours or change their roles, or whether you might look at organizational restructures, all of which you'd need to think about in the context of employment law protections. You might also look at reaching deferred payment agreements with creditors, particularly, for example, HMRC, if you have a VAT bill. You might look at, I mentioned restricted funds. You might look at varying some of those restricted funds, which would need consent from the Charity Commission if they're restricted in charity law. But if you have a pot of money for a particular purpose, but actually that is not a priority for you at the moment, although it's restricted in charity law, you might look at trying to change that. And of course, as you say, you might look at merging with another organization, whether that's a wholesale merger where two organizations come together, which can be really, really kind of successful if there are then organizational savings that could be made through streamlining certain functions. Or it might be a kind of a different kind of merger where you take on part of the business of another organization, or you spin out part of your organization into a new charity or an existing charity. When looking at any of those things, I think from the legal perspective, it's really important to ensure that there's alignment of your charitable missions, and that those two organizations, in part or in whole, can come together smoothly because the boards are working towards the same charitable purposes. That's important really for two reasons, I think. One is a cultural reason and a kind of drive reason. You need the organizations to be working towards a shared goal and have a shared understanding of what you're trying to achieve. Less excitingly, from a legal perspective, if they don't have compatible charitable objects, that isn't insurmountable. You might be able to get consent from the Charity Commission to change one of their charitable purposes, but it adds another layer of legal thinking and compliance to the process, which already you'll want to be keeping as streamlined as possible if you're looking at a merger, because one of the reasons might be that you're in financial difficulties. I think then when looking at merger, obviously a big part of the legal process is due diligence to understand what exactly your merger partner um, does, what the risks are, what their income streams are, all of that kind of thing. And while that is really important from a legal perspective, I think it can also really focus minds on impact, because you can really get into the detail of what the synergies might be and where you can continue to add value, and increase the value that you add to the communities you serve. Um, we actually produced a guide on mergers, which I'll share a link to in a moment in case that's helpful. And if people have specific questions about mergers, happy to speak to that. But again, I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating, and it's really helpful, at least for me, to kind of reframe the way I think about mergers as a sort of part of that spectrum of the options that are available, rather than think it's quite easy to kind of put it in a separate bucket and it be treated as quite a separate thing. But actually seeing that as part of the kind of the range of options that are available to an organisation. And we always talk about kind of starting those conversations where possible in kind of good times, and knowing who your mission aligned organizations might be. So um, yeah, that's just prompted those thoughts for me. I also think there's this thing across all of that menu that you've just been talking about of having kind of carving out separate and balanced spaces within trustee conversations for the kind of legal and financial aspects of any sort of change, and then the kind of impact and reach and kind of more what's the impact of this going to be on our community, and what does this change, and kind of making sure that one of those conversations doesn't dominate the other, I suppose, as you are navigating this as a board. So that's enormously helpful. So we'll move on to our next speakers, and then come back. If you do have any questions on mergers, spin outs, or anything like that, do pop them in the Q&A, and we'll come back to those shortly.
Wonder if I could just jump in
Of
on one
course.
of the
Yeah.
points you made there. I think that's really helpful to think about board meetings and discussions and kind of having space for the financial and legal side as well as the impact side, particularly if you are in kind of extreme financial difficulties and thinking about the risk of solvency. Um, Obviously it's a a lawyer's role to think about what happens when things go wrong, and this doesn't often happen. But if the Charity Commission were to investigate, if you were to kind of reach an insolvency position or anything like that, it's really helpful to ensure that board minutes are detailed and focused on, as you say, the legal duties and the charitable purposes, or at least every discussion is tied back to those. I think it can often be easy for boards to be super focused on the activities and the mission because that's what's exciting and that's why you're there on the board to deliver impact.
Mm.
But what the Charity Commission will look for is kind of that level of challenge of the senior leadership team, and kind of everything being drawn back to how is this in the best interests of serving our objects. So having that really clear kind of line in the minutes, I think is really helpful. So yeah, just say that was a really helpful point.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So we're now going to move to a speaking double act from Grant Taylor and Julie Nerney. So Grant and Julie are the former co-chairs of Getting on Board. So Julie first has extensive experience of trusteeship. She's held chair and non-executive director roles for social impact organisations, ranging from the UK Supreme Court to charities like Step to Fusion. She's an expert in business transformation and leadership and works as a coach, mentor, and guest lecturer. So that's Julie. Hello, Julie. And then Grant is an expert in working with boards to recruit trustees and executives as the founder of the recruitment agency Peridot Partners. He also brings trustee experience from his positions on the boards of ECHO, the Evelina Children's Heart Organisation, and Working Families. So Grant and Julie together became co-chairs of Getting on Board in 2022, steering the charity in pursuit of its mission to change the face of trusteeship through work with trustees, charities, and corporate partners. And then, after almost 20 years of operation, they supported the organisation through its closure in 2024. So, really excited to have you both with us, and hoping that you'll, between the two of you, be able to tell us a bit more about how you, as a board, came to the decision to close Getting on Board, and the ways in which you kept focused on impact and legacy as you stewarded that process.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks for the intro. So I'm going to provide some background and context to that first point about how we got to the decision to close, and then Grant's going to pick up from the point when we made that decision and how we ensured we maximised our legacy. As you've already explained, Naomi, Getting on Board was a small infrastructure charity whose mission was to change the face of trusteeship, and we did that by helping organisations to recruit, then induct, and then retain the most diverse group of trustees possible. And we provided a range of services, so free resources for charities and aspiring trustees, paid for consultancy and training for organisations and individuals. So we had the Charity Board Leadership Programme and the Trustee Learning Programme, and we worked with dedicated employers on partnership work. We also sourced bursaries from aspiring trustees for underrepresented groups so that they could attend training and build their awareness, ran webinars and panel events, and we created and curated the annual Festival of Trusteeship, which was designed to raise the profile of trusteeship. And when we got to the point we're going to talk to you about, we had a board of 10 trustees at the time. We'd championed our own best practice guidance. We'd undertaken a governance review. We were appointing 2 to 3 trustees every year to provide a balance of continuity and new energy. And we were aligning our experience requirements to the current and future needs of the charity. So we had a good balance of diversity in gender, race, and sexual orientation. And we were running a relatively new at the time, a co-chair model with Grant and myself. So as you say, we've been running for 20 years. We started in 2005, important to note, with just a freelancer, a single freelancer, as most small charities, who subsequently became its only employee. We then had a wider team of trusted associates and freelancers that supported all of our core activities, so whether it be marketing or communications or the design and delivery of our services. As a board, we met relatively frequently. So we had quarterly meetings. We had 2 away days a year where we focused on a combination of iterating our strategy and spending some time investing in our own development as a board. And then we had dedicated task and finish groups, and that allowed trustees to collaborate with the chief exec on developing new products or services or on the marketing communications. And we'd established a relatively new working group looking at finance and maturing the way that financial information was reported. And in terms of our overall funding model, yes, we tried to generate our own income, but we mainly submitted bids to foundations and organisations that had an interest in funding infrastructure charities. But most often that funding was associated with specific activities or outcomes. It rarely funded the core costs of running the charity, small though they were, with a part-time CEO and freelancers. So to compensate for this, we applied considerable effort to income generation. And that saw growth in turnover over just a few short years to over a quarter of £1 million, which for a small charity with one part-time employee was pretty good. And as the income grew, the finance working group got established. We collaborated with the chief exec to mature the way we were using financial information beyond a standard budget and variance analysis on a profit and loss account. And we started trying to track the relative profitability of each service so the board could make conscious choices. Where do we generate a surplus? And then how do we then reinvest that in free resources and activities which were essential to our mission and our charitable objects? We had minimum and stretch reserve levels, and we got aspirations to get to a point where we could afford to hire further employees because capacity was our limiting factor. But we paused this when our chief exec decided to step down because our attention needed to be placed on recruiting their successor. We picked it up again with the new CEO in post, and we continue to mature the financial information to include cash flow forecasting. We wanted to get to a point where we could make informed choices regarding the timing of any future employees. We had an active and very positive bid in for significant funding from a foundation. But it was during a detailed review of the cash flow forecast by that finance working group in late August 2024 that it became clear that our cash flow position wasn't sufficiently robust to bridge us to the point to when that funding would arrive. So the finance working group and the CEO shared this position at the subsequent board meeting in September, a couple of weeks later. And it was reluctantly agreed that it looked like the charity was no longer sustainable from a financial position and critically would not pass the going concern test for when we had to file our accounts in December. Now, there was funding in the pipeline, but it would be restricted to certain activities. Thinking about what Suhan had said earlier, the trustees were very mindful of our duties around disclosure in the annual report, which had to be filed within the next couple of months, as to whether we were a going concern, and our obligation to consider to ensure that the charity did not continue to trade if we knew or ought to have concluded that there was no reasonable prospect that the company could avoid insolvent liquidation, otherwise known as wrongful trading, which of course carries a personal liability for trustees too. So the board meeting discussed 3 potential scenarios: how we might be able to fund the work required to get back to a viable business model, whether a merger or a transfer of assets to a new partner was feasible, or to accept that the charity was no longer viable and what it would take to execute an orderly wind-up. And as you might expect, none of the trustees emotionally wanted to move to the third option immediately. As volunteers, they're committed to the organisation's mission and purpose, and we're really keen to find a way to keep the charity solvent. And our high-level analysis had indicated we probably needed another £50,000 worth of funding to meet those going concern obligations and provide the headroom to develop new income streams and funding bids for longer-term financial sustainability. So we took immediate action to undertake a further forensic level of financial analysis on cash. So write every payment due, every known future commitment against income received or contracted, all of our ongoing running costs, all of our contractual obligations. And alongside this, agreed that we'd explore routes for emergency funding support through our own networks. And we convened an additional and extraordinary board meeting 2 weeks later to review the outcome of that. And it was at that meeting that we saw that the forensic day-by-day analysis of the cash position showed us that we would have to have emergency funding by the end of October to remain solvent and for trustees to remain compliant with their own obligations and fiduciary duties, particularly in regard to our annual report and accounts. So we reluctantly had to acknowledge that the expert fundraising advice had indicated to us emergency funding would be very hard to secure and definitely not in such a short time window. So, of course, we had the future funding bid on the tape, technically on the table, but our new CEO had decided to resign in light of the financial position. And that meant our funding application was no longer viable. There's no employee to deliver the agreed activities, make further fundraising applications. So sadly, it became clear that despite the board's desire to try and keep the organisation alive, it just couldn't be matched by the practical ability to find and pay for the resources we needed in a time frame to maintain the organisation's going concern status. So we took a vote, and a majority vote of 9-1 reluctantly agreed that we should start winding up proceedings with immediate effect. Most importantly, to preserve the remaining cash to oversee an orderly wind up and maximise the money we could pay to our creditors. But from the very first discussion we had at that first board meeting, the forefront of our minds was how we might keep the legacy of the organisation and its resources alive. And once we made the decision to close, we turned our attention to how we did that, and I'll hand over to Grant for that part of the story.
Just as I sip my water. Thank you, Julie. Naomi, thanks for the introduction, and thank you everyone for inviting us in today. Delighted to be here. Hopefully in the future we can talk about different subjects rather than insolvency, but I'll carry on the story. So we were focused on protecting the legacy, preserving our impact, and that was split into two parts, sort of internal and external. So, excuse me. Internally, we needed to be sure that we managed the wind down effectively and we communicated well throughout with stakeholders and partners. So, whilst all the trustees wish we weren't in that situation, having accepted that we were, there was a determination by all of us that if this was the way forward, we needed to do it well. So, it was a team effort. Trustees were assigned roles based on their expertise. We had trustees leading on comms plan for different audiences, preparing communications for our associate community, partners, sponsors, customers with existing contracts, all ahead of a press release being issued and liaising with the sector press. It was really important to us that our friends and supporters heard the news from us before it was officially in the public domain. So we had an experienced charity leader liaising with the Charity Commission, one of our trustees, and filed an initial instant report because we wanted to be on the front foot just in case. We knew there was no wrongdoing, but it was important for us to disclose this and make sure that we kept them informed as things developed. And as it panned out, they were very happy with that, and there was no investigation of any kind. One trustee took over logins to email accounts and other systems to protect our data and make sure that automated messaging was in place. A couple of trustees led on packaging up our materials and content, and essentially starting to prepare for that handover part of our legacy plan. So as co-chairs, we sent weekly updates to the board, all of the board members, so they were aware of how things were developing. We led on the liaison with the appointed insolvency practitioner and all the associated information gathering and documentation that goes with that process. It's quite an onerous task, and don't wish it on anybody to go through it, but it took a lot of time, and it was really important to get that right. So whilst it was upsetting for everybody involved who had invested a huge amount of time over the years and made every effort to avoid the outcome, our commitment was maintained to closing well and making sure that we had a legacy plan that could drive continued impact. We were aware that we weren't the only organisation operating in that space, and that was a real comfort to us. It gave us the confidence that we would be able to find a good home for our work in places where it would continue to be used, for our mission and for the purposes it was developed. So our content was split largely into three different areas. There are 3 resources that had been available online for some time, and these are mainly guides and videos. There was proprietary content for training and consulting services and some primary sector research. And then there was the Festival of Trusteeship, the event and the brand. So our former CEO, who had been notified in the first tranche of communications, she came back and she stepped in to work with the associate community to pull together a list of options. And those options complemented people that came forward once our news of closure became public. The Festival of Trusteeship is a key external event. We're very proud of it. It didn't run in 2024, unfortunately, due to the winding down process. But you might have seen that we're delighted to have passed this to Eastside people, who are running the festival again this year from the 3rd to the 7th of November in Trustees Week. The Festival of Trusteeship itself is a week-long event. It's a series of events for both prospective and committed trustees who want to keep learning, want to keep developing, as well as for charity leaders who want to understand best practice in trustee recruitment and inclusive governance. And we're delighted to see that two key figures in the programme that instigated and ran it for many years, Penny Wilson and Fiona McCausland, they were getting on board doing this. They now continue to have leading roles in the delivery of that event. And Eastside people, they have the resources to make it bigger and better than it's ever been. So with the support of Penny Fiona, the festival has a great new home and a very positive future. The resources themselves have gone to a range of different places, including the Cranfield Trust. They have been designated as the master host for publishing all of Getting On Board's YouTube content within their governance channel. So this is around 100 videos. There are 67 videos from within the trustee learning program that we had, and it offers free content on almost anything you can think of a charity trustee might need to know. And I urge you to go over and have a look. These videos they can be downloaded directly. They're being hosted in a wide variety of other places as well, including Association of Chairs and NCVO. The Getting On Board website is still live, so you can still download free resources, including the comprehensive guides, how to diversify your charities board and how to recruit charity trustees, which are practical step-by-step guides. They've received many thousands of downloads and got great feedback over the years, and they've been shared widely. And Reach Volunteering is now master host for those guides. One of them, maybe both of them, are on Google Books. So we had about 30 organisations interested in hosting or receiving content, and we assessed each one for suitability. We shared what was asked for in the end, once we'd assessed that, if it was appropriate. And most of those resources are now being used with the communities associated with those organisations. Most of our courses had content designed by associates, and of course we respected the nature of their IP in this associate designed content, and this hasn't been shared and will be deleted when the insolvency process is completed. So alongside the insolvency process and our work to ensure that the legacy would live on, we explored several options to generate income, as Julie said earlier, from assets to maximise payments to creditors. It's really important that we did that. Part of that was the value of our database. Part of that was the research we'd undertaken to develop a trustee network. But unfortunately, after some promising discussions, it was to no avail. So I would say that this has been a successful legacy plan, and I hope others would agree. The festival lives on. It's got a future. The key resources are being hosted elsewhere and by organisations that have good values and recognise the importance of that content. And the programmes and training courses we once ran are mostly being delivered by those associates who ran them in new ways and with new partner organisations. So a lot of the work that Getting On Board was doing is being done elsewhere by others. So finally, the time and effort expended by trustees and other volunteers, such as Penny, the previous CEO, who came back and played a key role in ensuring the legacy, was significant. It took a great deal of time and resource to close the organisation well, and we hold our heads high actually and say that whilst some people were unfortunately left out of pocket at the end, our decision to close quickly, distribute our resources and ensure the legacy transfer was absolutely the right one to take at the right time. Our role of trustees was to comply with the legislative guidance by minimising losses, and we did that. And I think we've maximised the potential of Getting On Board's work to live on to. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for sharing that so openly. We've had lots of people praising the kind of open case study you provided, and also just for all of the work that you did in stewarding that closure. It's I think a lot to be proud of. we're going to go to our final speaker before we come to full Q&A, but I just wondered how was the full, obviously you outlined, Julie, the decision to close the board, but there was obviously then the kind of need to step up the role, the commitment of trustees, and that was obviously a new expansion of responsibilities for them. And I just wondered, was that something that the whole board were kind of happy to do? Was it, how did you kind of manage that change to trustee duties?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Naomi, because as Grant said, it took a lot of time and effort to do this and do this well. And I think it's important to remember that trustees are volunteers. All these people had day jobs, and this was almost a full-time job in itself. So the fact that everybody was committed to closing well meant that everybody stepped up and shared the load. So as Grant outlined, the roles and responsibilities were split that naturally aligned with people's expertise. And we were able to share the burden. Grant and I have said this many times. I'm very glad I wasn't a chair on my own in this situation. Having a co-chair was massively important in terms of steering and stewarding this. But it's a really important point to note the onus of this place is on people who are volunteers.
Thank you both so much. As I say, we'll come back. I can see a few questions already for you in the Q&A, so we'll come back for more questions after we've heard from our final speaker, who's been waiting very patiently. So now introducing Alice Casey, who is Director of Programmes at Maudsley Charity, where she leads their work to develop impact and innovation through grant making. Alice is a leading expert in developing innovative solutions to social challenges through her previous role at Nesta as their head of new operating models and developing new forms of empowerment at the participation charity Involve, as well as her role as trustee of Local Trust and director of Crowdfunder. Alice is also an active participant in the open data community as a founding director of 360 Giving and a chairperson of the Democracy Club. So quite the CV coming to this conversation. So Alice, we've heard about kind of quite different models that organisations can take and the decisions they can choose to make. And I was wondering if you could kind of complete the set and tell us a bit about your work at Maudsley Charity. So as Director of Programmes, I know a key aspect of your work is to deliver impact and innovation through grant making by enabling cross-sector collaboration. So I was wanting to ask what you think trustees should know about how commissioners and funders assess partnership working, how they see that as improving impact.
Thanks. So the speakers that we just heard have done a great job of sort of outlining what happens towards the end, and I really, really praise like people, Grant, Julie and others who've shared a story of what happens towards the end and the onerous tasks that can fall onto people. So I just want to say thank you for that, because I'm going to talk a bit about things that can happen earlier on to sort of try and divert course earlier. So I just want to say a few things, three things really, before I get on to what the sort of meat of what I'm going to say about what funders look for in partnership working. Three bits of advice that I've learned through things not going to plan sometimes. Grasp the nettle early. If you spot something that is not working, that you question why you're doing a certain activity, particularly when it's not contributing to the bottom line or it's costing more than it ought to, grasp that nettle early on, even if it's difficult, and ask the questions. The organisations who do that are the ones who can sort of weather storms more effectively. So do make sure that you stop doing things that you're not clear about why you're doing them. It sounds very basic, but a lot of people, through having goodwill and a sort of voluntary sector kind of mindset, can avoid those conversations. So that's one thing that I've personally learned through the various organisations I've been part of. Second is a recommendation to use data. So I would say that, I guess, use 360 Giving. Go and have a look at what other trusts and foundations are funding in your spaces and find your collaborators that you might not realise were there. There's a good way to do that by just going to have a look at the data flows and seeing where money is going. That obviously is going to help you to do that. And then a third thought that not everybody's able to do, but just consider if you're able to have a trading arm of some kind, a CIC or another form of like bringing in income to make you more resilient. So I'd say those are just three thoughts on like when you're working in financial constraints, ways that I've seen people be more effective than average when it comes to the difficult times. It helps you weather the storm to think about those things. So stop doing things you're not clear about. Use the data that you have available to find your partners and consider, have you diversified all your trading options? In terms of going back to Naomi's question, what do funders look for? Well, I'm going to be tricksy and I'm going to say it kind of depends. So it depends on the funder, it depends on the thing that's getting supported. But what I can say what I look for personally, and it will be proportionate. Everything is proportionate to what you're trying to achieve. So a good funder with good practices should be thinking in that kind of way. Not everybody does do that, and there can be all sorts of constraints at the funders' end of things as well. Sometimes funders are one-man bands, and they're really just trying to do their best, and they have to do more of a cookie cutter approach. But the best practice funders, who are probably the more supportive ones to work with, will have enough resources to be able to work with you in a sort of responsive and thoughtful kind of way that's proportionate to your organisation's needs and things like that, and able to be supportive and flexible. Not everybody can do that, so go in with open eyes as to what kind of funder you're working with. So what do I look for? Given that at the Morsey Charity, we do have that luxury of having a bit of flexibility. So I look for, first of all, relationships. What's the track record of the relationships between the organisations who are going to be working together? That can go from the sort of personal level collaboration to the sort of organisational. Do they have an MOU? How developed are they? How long have they worked together? Then if you're talking about bidding in for a new project or a piece of project work or core funding, I'm looking straight to the budget to see, are they putting the money where the mouth is in terms of what is actually going to be delivered? So do the partners get an equal share? Do they get an appropriate share to the size of, sort of their aims? And that can be really imbalanced in different sectors. So obviously wages in certain sectors are really different. So if you're a small voluntary organisation working with a national, let's say a public body or something like that, that can show lots of disparities. So you want everybody as a funder to be feeling like they're getting treated in an even-handed way. So the best partnerships will have a level of, not parity exactly, but an even-handedness in the financials. Then I'd be looking at governance. So are the organisations really practically clear on the roles when they're going to collaborate? If it's a project, do you have a responsible lead? It's the basic kind of stuff that you would expect to be there, but it's surprisingly often neglected. So just having complementary, clear roles for the organisations and individuals, that's really important as well. Two more, which have come up a little bit. Well, actually, one's come up and one hasn't. The one that hasn't come up as much, which I think is very important, is just paying attention to risk and knowing that we're in a very volatile, sort of wider kind of situation at the moment in terms of finances and in terms of shocks to investments. So from a funder perspective, funders are really, sort of squeezed at the minute. And so they're thinking about risk, financial risk more and more avidly in a way that I think is, sort of like can be quite tricky sometimes when you're bidding in. So they're going to be looking for return on the sort of the funds that are going out, making sure that the activity is good value. And then finally, it has been mentioned, but due diligence. So I'll be looking for the basic due diligence work that needs to be done. So go back to the basics. I would say don't neglect the basics when you're thinking about partnership, and make sure you're really working through those things fully. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alice. I just wanted to follow up on that because I think it can be tempting for delivery organisations and charities to think of partnership as a bit of a magic bullet of kind of solving financial difficulties, leveraging more funds and kind of relieving costs. And I was just wondering if there's any examples from your experience of kind of where partnership has helped to relieve resources in challenging financial contexts, and where it's actually an investment, it improves the impact of the work, but not necessarily the kind of financial solution that organisations might be looking for.
A lot of the work that I've been involved in or overseen has been innovation work, and it's an easier sell to funders to do something new, even though it shouldn't be, but it is. And so innovation partnerships, I would say very rarely have I seen them saving you sort of time and therefore money as a smaller organisation. So usually I would not see a partnership to be the right solution if you're doing some sort of innovation project to save money, is what I mean. So it can be very fruitful, but usually there's actually an overhead to developing and settling a partnership. in that context. So that's sort of my main experience. When it comes to things that are further down the line, like you're a delivery organisation and you're more mature, you can see where things might be complementary to your work. You can sort of identify a skill set or a partner that you might be able to subcontract or work to in the way that I think it was Grant outlining, people who are delivering modules of your work who could enhance your impact, but without bringing in a sort of liability directly to your core funding, your cash flow. Those are the kind of things that can be quite fruitful. So you've got just a very clear role for that partnership to happen. And I think that's the one where you're more likely to see cost savings when you're working in that way. So that would be my thought. Don't expect partnerships to be financially going to save you much. In fact, they're probably going to cost you more in many cases.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alice. And we're now going to come on to our kind of Q&A with the whole panel. So thanks for those with questions for waiting patiently for that. Do share any questions that you may have in the chat, in the Q&A box. I'll be coming to the ones we already have shortly. But first, I wanted just to take Chair's prerogative to start the Q&A. And coming back to something that Suan said in the first slot around kind of this need that you'll be judged kind of proportionally, I suppose, based on financial literacy and the skill set of trustees, and that being kind of core to the board's duties and expectations. I was wondering if I could ask each of our speakers today to just reflect on what role they see financial literacy playing on the board and how boards can build this capacity. I know from kind of trustee recruitment, you often see ads out there looking for accountants, people to play that kind of treasurer role to build that financial literacy in one person. But I'm also interested in kind of what are the other options that are available to charities who want to kind of increase their scrutiny. Grant, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I see this a lot in recruitment where organisations want to recruit the treasurer, the financial expert, and the relief in the other trustees when you do. And we make it really clear that actually recruiting at least two is helpful. So you get two financial perspectives and they can challenge each other potentially. But it's the responsibility of all trustees to be financially literate. Suan was talking about this earlier. It's really important that everybody can understand the position and has the confidence to ask questions, because it's their responsibility and liability at the end of the day. So that comes down to induction, the expectations that are set, potentially training, and potentially organisations on here or that are interested in preparing trustees for trusteeship can play some role in emphasising that and giving people the basic tools. There's always a sense of bespoking when you enter an organisation to understand the nuances of their finances. But my ultimate point here, to let others chip in, is it's everybody's responsibility, and you cannot just rely on a treasurer to give you that assurance.
Yeah.
And as you might expect, Naomi, I'm going to completely support what Grant has just said. But I'm also going to make the point about the duty of care that chairs have to their board team. We forget about this. These are volunteers that bring their time and expertise. And when we established the finance working group, we had people with financial expertise on it, but deliberately others that didn't. Because it was really important to develop the skills of the trustees. You're volunteering, you're giving your time to an organisation. What are you getting back in return other than feeling good about the fact that you've volunteered? So that growth and that learning and development, and our away days when we had development sessions, if we had trustees with particular expertise and disciplines, they ran sessions to help raise the collective knowledge level. And it's so important because it's everybody's responsibility. It's not just the finance person.
Yeah, I love that idea, Julie, to kind of bring different skill sets, not just for the support of the charity, but for the support of the board and our board colleagues. That's great. Suan or Alice, do you have anything to add on the kind of financial literacy and how we can build it point?
I could just add that the reality is that a lot of people will sit through the finance section and not contribute. And that's because there's a lot of nervousness about being wrong or not having the financial skills to answer a question on the spot. People are generally, who are not financially trained, have that worry. And just maybe to try to, in your board, to have ways of presenting information that is a bit less intimidating than just getting the papers in a pack and just be like, now we're on to the finance item, off we go. You can set an example if you are like a chair or one of the sort of like people presenting financial information to sort of say, well, this is kind of like what it means to me, or I actually don't know the answer to this question, but we're going to look at, but just some kind of way of kind of diffusing that worry about talking about finances to help people engage with it. Maybe using charts as well and visuals to help pull that sort of the figures off the page. I think it's just really important to not let that happen, that sort of lack of comment in the meeting, because you kind of know that you just, sort of treading water and not scrutinizing it enough if that's happening too much.
Great, thank you, Alice.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's really important both for the kind of finance team and treasurer to try to bring everyone up to speed and make sure that everyone is able to engage properly. But equally, it's incumbent on every new trustee to put that time in with the finance team or the treasurer or the chair and go through the accounts and try to really understand it. Because I think, lots of trustees will have been there, otherwise you'll be in your third, fourth meeting. You've been on the board for a year and you realize, I actually don't really understand whether we have enough money for next year. I'm relying on someone to tell me if we don't. And it's such a significant part of the role that it is really important just to, from the outset, try and get your head into it and think, frame it in really basic ways if you're not a finance person, but where does our money come from? How, touch and go is cash flow every month? How far in advance are we getting our money, and how easy is it to kind of press pause on certain parts of our expenditure? Kind of those headline questions, I think, will really help to get your head into it. And then there's no shame in asking the really basic questions.
Yeah, fantastic. I love those headline questions too. It's just kind of the starting point to build from. Julie and Grant, your case study prompted lots of kind of questions as well as enthusiasm and gratitude for sharing that. But I'm keen to bring in Alice and Suan on a couple of the things we've had. So the first question, which came from Ross, was asking kind of about the strategic planning that happened at governance level and what kinds of timescales trustees need to be thinking about as they're thinking about some of these things. So that's one that I'd love to hear in your specific case study, Julie and Grant, how you were thinking about this and different timescales you were looking at, but also Suan, I guess, from your professional advice, what you would recommend for trustees.
So when Grant and I took on the co-chairs role, we had an existing strategy which we took through a refresh process as part of the governance review, because the trustees are there to support the organisation's aims. So we needed to be clear in service of what were we looking to recruit and construct our board composition around. And then we reviewed it annually. And we agreed at the time, and given that's 2 or 3 years ago, that doing anything much longer than a 3-year cycle in the current environment was probably going to result in wasted effort on something that we almost were certain was going to change. I have to say, I sit on half a dozen boards at the moment, and nobody is planning beyond a 3-year time horizon now. Just the change in the world, whether it be the wider macro conditions, the advance of AI and technology, and so on. It's you could have placeholders for the out years and do a traditional 5-year strategy, but actually most people are doing 3, and that's what we did. We planned on a 3-year cycle, and we reviewed it every year to check that it was still right, whether our context had changed, whether we needed to course correct. And at the end of 3 years, we would have done another full refresh.
Fantastic. Alice, do you want to come in first, and then we'll come to Suan?
I was just going to say it might offer an interesting contrast. So at the Morsey Charity, where like one of those very ancient London charities that's got, it's come from the Bedlam Hospital originally and owns all sorts of assets all over London. It's one of those ones that's been around for so many years. We say 800, but take that one with a pinch of salt. So we look ahead a long time, and so we do a 5-year plan still. And even though we know that our investment income might be, sort of pretty bumpy, we're looking, when we do our next strategy refresh, I'm going to even try to look a bit further ahead, in the sense of we want to set a direction to tackle some of the most challenging, complex issues that we know are not easy to address with short-term projects, and we want to extend the length of our funding. So just to say, it depends on the organisation, and there are some if you go and have a look at the 360 Giving data, you'll find some sort of like very interesting older organisations like that, where funding is a bit more long-term and is a bit more core. And I think that's just really worth knowing about. If you are also trying to tackle complex issues, you're working in a more long-term way. There are funders also out there who are thinking in that kind of way too. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think there's definitely a shift in the kind of foundation landscape and funder landscape to looking at long-term impact and really changing wider societal issues. And different foundations are going about that in different ways. Obviously, there's a shift to kind of more core cost funding, more flexible funding, more long-term funding. Others are looking at disbanding and kind of giving very significant amounts of funding now rather than that long-term impact. I think for trustee boards, I agree it's kind of important for every organization to look at its own circumstances. And so part of that is where are you setting your reserves policy? And part of that is what are our, getting into the detail, what does our lease look like? What's our break clause on our lease? What are our employment terms and conditions? How much have we contractually agreed for redundancy payments? That kind of thing, and looking at your particular funding portfolio as well. Is your funding from contracts for services from individuals or local authorities? In which case, it probably is relatively kind of demand and economy dependent, or is it long-term trust and foundations funding where actually you have a number of 5-year grants, most of which have 2 or 3 years to run, in which case you have that flexibility probably to look longer term. That then impacts into how you engage with the finances as well. And so it's really important to understand not just kind of quarterly cash flow forecasts you're getting or the annual accounts and the annual budget, but also looking at your funding pipeline over the next couple of years. It's great to know that halfway through the year you're 70% funded for the year and you're relatively confident about that last 30%. But you then need to know, okay, well, when we hit next year and the year after, are we losing big chunks of multi-year funding? And what's our plan for that? What are our kind of touch points and check-ins? And it's difficult. There is obviously a lot to think about, but I think there's probably no one easy answer for how far in the future should a board be looking when thinking about those bigger questions. Obviously, as you say, Julie, for the kind of actual strategy of what are we going to achieve, I think lots of organisations are finding that shorter term is easier to plan for at the moment.
Grant.
Yeah, this ties in with the themes that we're discussing today. I think a lot of the smaller charities will be thinking about financial sustainability first and foremost, and it's really important that organisations make sure that that's in place. It sounds really obvious, doesn't it? Something Susan said earlier today was around how you become more acutely interested in the finances when you're challenged, and maybe you're a bit higher view until you are. Well, lots of organisations need to be looking in the way that whether they feel challenged or not, they need to be looking as if they are. To make sure that financial sustainability is there. And what I'm seeing with smaller organisations at the moment is that they can't see the future clearly. They need to understand their financial scenarios. They might be already eating into reserves slightly. And actually, there's some really tough and decisive short-term decisions that need to be made first and foremost. Because if you get those right, then you can start to look for long-term impact. And I fear that some people here today might be thinking, how can we possibly look at long-term impact when our sustainability is potentially threatened? So there's another perspective there.
Alice.
So, again, just bringing the funder, like a funder point of view in, the organisations, when you're sort of things are more and more competitive when you have open calls, and the organisations that stand out from the crowd when you're receiving bids are definitely the ones who have thought about the long term, and that just sings through what they're doing. You see it in the way they put their bids together, at the financials, and the sort of the thought that has gone into what they're doing to support that longer term mission. So just say those things definitely come across. And when I've been on the other side of the fence in my trustee roles, or non-exec director roles, looking at finances, quarterly, to be worried about the next quarter and can you pay everybody. It's not a nice place to be, or it's incredibly stressful, and often people are volunteers doing that. But just to say that I think that it's incumbent on funders to be thinking in the long term, because of that situation. You want to try and alleviate as much as possible so that people can really do the job that they're there to do, that they're passionate about doing, which is to run voluntary sector organisations for that public benefit purpose. So just to sort of say the things in theory, if we get the system right, and that's what MPC are sort of bringing us together, I guess, to think about, is that those things should be working together. The long-term vision, this long-term support, the core funding offer, and I just put a link in the chat to a bit of work from a little while ago on core funding that Ivar had done with Pears Foundation. That should be working with the support for people who are, sort of trying to live quarter to quarter with their budgets. Anyway, so we can put the world to rights.
That actually brings me, Alice, to the next question I wanted to put to yourself and to Julie and Grant again, because I think it stemmed from their experience, which is just about that kind of, I think, Julie, you were talking about being in the position where actually you knew you wouldn't have the time scale to get the emergency funding in to bridge that gap that you faced. And so I guess any extra reflections from you on that, and then a question for Alice as our funder representative today about kind of how, I guess, grant makers can both act more urgently when needed, but also keep that long-term time horizon in mind.
I think it was Grant was on the board for longer before we became co-chairs, but so he might have something he wants to add to this. But I think as an infrastructure charity, funding is harder to secure by the very nature of what you do, and getting core funding to cover your costs. So just linking back to that strategy conversation, we absolutely had an impact plan and the theory of change for 10, 20 years out, but we needed to metaphorically eat every year. And so there's no sustainable income stream for infrastructure charities in that way. So you're going from bid to bid to bid in order to keep the mission and the purpose alive. And so I think there's something in the funding environment that was always challenging for us, which is why we had to start to think about generating our own income streams in order to try and provide more runway, a longer runway for us to be able to do that. And the reality also, and I say this as somebody who's started and run a number of businesses and received private investment for that, is when people are making investments, they're looking at the people they're investing in as well as the thing that they're investing in. And our CEO had resigned. There was nobody in the building. So that was a really difficult, having a conversation with a funder that says, please give me money. We have nobody to do anything with it. I mean, we wouldn't have said it like that, right? But that was an impossible situation. So even if we got to a point where there was emergency fundraising, we didn't have an employee to do the work. And I think that was the final tipping point for us. But Grant might have something else he wants to add.
Yeah, I think timing was a real challenge for us, and timing always plays a part in these things. We'd identified some gaps that we were addressing, so getting on board didn't do the final bit, which was actually putting people on boards. So it was harder to measure its impact, and we'd done a piece of work on our theory of change and how we were going to measure impact and demonstrate that better. Anecdotally, people loved what we did, and it did have an impact on boards and people and individuals getting onto boards. But would they have got onto boards with or without getting on boards help? So there's something here about demonstrating impact that we were working on, and we could have done with a bit more time. Maybe it should have been done earlier. There's something here about when I reflect, being slightly too trusting. I've run a small business, so is Julie, and we've grown them, and we understand numbers. But there were one or two things that we didn't ask until we were in crisis that we should have done. So I think there's a bunch of factors here, and I might be digressing from the point slightly, but I think timing was a real challenge for us, and that's the main point I want to express, because the timing of the CEO resigning, the timing of our growth, the timing of our impact planning, the timing of some of our questions potentially, all of these things factored in. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Yeah, you make me think we've had the point, I think, from several of you today about kind of asking those questions early, having these conversations early, which I think comes through really clearly. And also the secondary point about kind of making hard decisions early. So not just, and kind of speaks to this idea of there being a kind of menu of options for ensuring and delivering impact, even as things get difficult. But actually, that option space, as you described in your case study, does shrink quite rapidly the more time passes. And so actually being bold and being decisive as boards so that we can kind of keep more of those options on the table is really important. So certainly something I'm going to be taking away, that kind of time dynamic of some of these conversations. Alice, I was going to come to you.
Can I just add something? Sorry, just quickly, Naomi, to that. I think there is something in this that even with trustee boards asking the right questions and doing the right things, if you are a small charity, you have a perfect storm of things all hitting at the same time, you don't have the resilience to be able to withstand that. Yeah.
And I think that's where your case study is so brilliant for, I hope, for attendees here today, in terms of, success doesn't have to be we're still here, a year later from all of those conversations, but that you've stewarded that well, you've ensured that legacy, and that you've kind of taken that forward. And so, yeah, I hope that's the kind of takeaway, absolutely, in a really challenging context.
Sorry for jumping in, Alice.
Alice, you want to come in?
I confess, Naomi, you're going to have to tell me the question again. I ought to have written it down.
It was just about that balance between kind of how trustees can be responsive to kind of urgent short-term emergency needs, and that kind of, where a 2-month gap might be a real thing, versus having that longer-term systemic perspective that you were setting out before.
Just to clarify, I think the first time you said how the funders can think about that, the short-term gaps. Yeah. Well, in COVID is a great example. So we go and look at what happens when a national emergency hits. Funders can suddenly get together and organise and release funds from all sorts of places and suspend rules that are normally sacrosanct in the great guidebooks of sort of trustee governance structures. But in normal times, trustees and grant funders in particular are lovers of our schemes of delegation and our controls, and we love all that duties, processes, so, and there's a good reason for it, which is because, in the old days, in the bad old days, charitable funds were not transparent. They were given, I would say, I'm talking some years ago, to people in the know. There wasn't such an emphasis on people being able to access and diversify who is able to get hold of funding. So a lot of structures are brought in to try and make that more transparent, open, accountable. And I think that's a good thing overall. And it also provides some discipline internally. So your SLTs within trusts and foundations have a lot of power individually, because of the way trusts, sort of recommend to their trustee boards who should get funding. And sometimes these are huge sums that are going out. So it's a long way of saying, when there's a true emergency, suddenly those rules were, sort of people found ways around it. But at the moment, I wouldn't say that it's a slow burn. It's a bit like the environmental crisis. People are sort of slowly warming up, and we're seeing the financial, sort of issues getting harder and harder, and the environment getting more difficult. So you are seeing a slow change of the rules happening, but it's not really like providing. So a slow change of the rules. Sorry, I should just say what those things are. So the kinds of things that I'm seeing more of are more co-funding, more longer term thinking, more conversations among funders about how they work together more effectively to make their money go further, greater accountability, and saying 360 again. We had the 10-year anniversary recently, and we've got over 300 funders publishing now. So that is unheard of. We wouldn't have thought that would happen. People are very private about their funding. So those are all good things, but it won't help your, sort of hit the glass in an emergency kind of moment as a small charity organisation. I would say there, you've got to have personal relationships, possibly philanthropy, possibly, you're going to be doing a fundraiser or a crowdfunder as well. Those are the kind of things that people do in those emergency situations. They're much faster to have a philanthropist on your side or an emergency crowdfunder from your supporters to get you out of a financial hole than you are to get a sort of emergency funding. That said, I believe there are still bridging funds available from certain foundations and trusts who will provide that kind of finance, but I'm a little bit less up to speed on who those are now. But those are the different options and the context, I'd say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alice. Just a couple of questions that have come in from Lynn on reserves, and just about kind of managing, I suppose, having the right reserves to do what you did, Julian Grant, and kind of wind down well, but also ensuring that that's kind of not getting in the way of current fundraising or current decisions, I suppose, to investments to potentially increase our impact. So I guess a question for all of you, whoever wants to come in, about getting the balance right between spend now and reserves for future dates, and also getting the narrative right in how you talk about that.
I think there's a point here about it depends on the size scale of your organisation and where you are on your journey. So when getting on board started out with just a freelancer, there was no reserves policy. And then we got to a point where we had employees and contractual commitments, and we made sure we had a reserves policy that had 3 months worth of runway, where we could wind up the organisation in an orderly fashion. But the trustees were keen to say, can we have 6 months? And so we had a minimum and a stretch target. So whilst we tried to aim for the stretch, if there was an opportunity which enabled us to extend our impact or invest to generate more income, we would have some flex between the minimum and the stretch level.
Sorry, still on mute. Thank you, Julie. Is there anyone else who wants to share perspectives on reserves and that balance?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it definitely depends on the organisation. There's no hard and fast rule, and the Charity Commission doesn't expect charities to have any particular level of reserves. It just says that charity trustees should think about what their reserves should be and adopt a policy that is appropriate for them. I think, it would be surprised and critical of a charity which didn't have any reserves and which didn't have any kind of plan to achieve some level of reserves. And clearly having some level of reserves is really important and helpful for the kind of situation that Julie and Grant have spoken to. At the other end, clearly it's difficult to make choices to divert funds away from day-to-day impact work to your reserves, particularly where you have a stretch target and you can comfortably say, well, we're within the policy because we've hit the minimum target, and it makes that choice to redivert funds, I think, harder. Alice, I'd be curious from your perspective. We hear a lot about charities being concerned about having too much in their reserves and funders being nervous about that. In my experience, I'm not sure that funders generally are nervous about that, as long as there's a sensible explanation for a strong amount in the reserves. But I'd be curious to see what your perspective is.
I think it's very interesting. So personally, I think charities should have healthy reserves, because I've been on the other side of the fence, and I think it's very good practice to have, 6 months plus in the bank. And some of that's wind up, but, sort of almost trying to build an opportunity fund, for yourself. So you can give yourself a little bit of something to help you do a new thing, whatever it might be. I think that's great. That's my personal take. A lot of people in the foundation sector still have this nervousness about they've got too much money in their reserves. I don't understand where it comes from. I think it's quite old-fashioned thinking, to my mind. I don't believe, Sue-Ann, that there is some sort of legal basis for that, or no. So I think it's just, I actually find it a bit Victorian. I'm just like, what, the poor, charities shouldn't have money that they can sort of decide. They're a mature group of adults who are there to look after this organisation, and they think it's a good idea. So I personally think as long as you've got a policy on it, like why that amount, what's it there for, then I think that's a really responsible and sensible thing to do, given the climate. So yeah, it's a bit of a bugbear, actually.
Thank you, Alice, and thanks everyone for that. I'm conscious of time, and we're kind of drawing towards the end of the event, so I'm going to revisit my chair's prerogative just to ask a couple of closing questions to you all. I have 2 questions I want to ask, so I'm going to ask one of them to Alice and Grant and the other one to Sue-Ann and Julie. So Alice and Grant, if you could give one piece of advice to a trustee on a board in financial difficulty, what would it be? Who wants to jump in first? Alice, go for it.
I can. My human advice would be to take care of yourself and your fellow trustees and staff, emotionally and for their well-being, because in a small charity, they're going through that situation. That is the number one thing, is to look after your staff, and then if everybody is feeling capable and supported, then you get on to all your sort of legal and financial obligations. But if you have an unwell staff team, or your trustees are not able to cope very well with it, then you're in a lot more trouble. So I'd say just watch out for those well-being elements and not just the sort of legal side of things straight away.
Great, thank you, Alice. Grant?
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate this effectively, but what's in my head, I will unload and we'll see. So I talked about addressing the financial sustainability first and not thinking long term. But when I think about the example of getting on board, we had a real opportunity. I think there was a period of a week or two where we were really working to think of all the options available to keep the thing going, to raise funds and explore ideas. So we had, do we do all these things or do we not? Do we play it safe? But what really helps, I think, is to keep the thinking long term, because even if we would have secured 50,000 or whatever it took to stay afloat for a year and maybe pursue other opportunities, I think the reality was that we weren't going to be able to develop a sustainable funding stream, a new income stream that we had been working on for a couple of years. So what was the point? So you have to have that short-term challenge. What do we do? Do we go that direction, or another direction? But actually, if we did go in one of those directions and it was successful, what does that really mean? And the final point on that is our legacy went well because there are other organisations in our space. And as much as people had a lot of love and support for getting on board, this is controversial, but I don't think it needed to exist anymore. There are other organisations doing what we do really, really well. And we were going to fight for employer money. And there are other organisations training people in corporates to be trustees that are much better resourced. So it would have been a continual struggle. So balance the short-term views with the long-term thinking and a sense of a sprinkle of reality.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. That's really helpful. And my final question for Julie and Suan is: how can boards create a kind of culture or process where difficult financial conversations become more normalised? What would your kind of one tip be for that?
So I think it comes down to the way the organisation is chaired, because the chair sets the tone, and it's creating a culture of psychological safety and openness and transparency. And other speakers have touched on this already. There is no such thing as a stupid question. And somebody who isn't financially qualified can sometimes ask the question that unlocks things that people who are financially qualified don't look to, because we're all guided by our own experiences. So I think having a truly collective endeavour, a culture where everybody feels comfortable and able to contribute, is absolutely essential to good governance, full stop. And if you do that well, then I think you create an environment where those difficult financial conversations can be held. And listen to your trustee team. If they're struggling or they're not speaking, Alice was talking earlier on about nobody saying anything when the finance item comes up, then you need to spend some time working with your team about giving them the confidence to be able to do that, possibly outside of a formal board meeting, training, support, mentoring, stuff you do together as a board development activity.
Great, thank you, Julie. Suan?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think it's another practical tip is just remembering to ask those questions before the conversations are difficult. So, if you have a new program or a line item in the budget, asking the questions of, say that there's a new role, thinking, okay, well, do we have the funding for this role for the long term? If not, are we thinking about fixed term contracts, even if that's not aligned with what we'd like to do? Kind of all of those kinds of questions, so that people are used to those questions being raised. If you're doing an annual salary review, kind of asking the difficult questions, even in a really healthy year where you'll kind of have a really healthy income, so that it's just the norm to ask those questions, so that everyone feels comfortable asking them, and so that the staff team don't feel attacked, so that there's just that culture of everyone understanding that's the role of the board to test some of those things. And it doesn't mean that you're challenging the staff's judgment, you're just trying to understand, offering a different perspective. And then just to your point, Julie, about training, which I think is a really good one. I think a great thing would be as if every chair or trustee left this meeting and thought, do I think everyone on the board understands the finances? And if not, can I suggest we just dedicate 20 minutes, half an hour at the next board meeting to going through the accounts in a really simple way and talking through where we are, might be kind of whatever the phrase is, grandmothers and eggs for half the board. But if it teaches half the board something they don't know, that'd be really, really valuable.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you all so much and for all of your input this afternoon. It's been fantastic to have you with us. You've actually managed to touch on all of my kind of key takeaways and reflections as I bring us to a close. Before I do that, I just wanted to invite all of our attendees over to Menti. I've just popped a link in the chat. That's just a space for some kind of reflection and self-assessment based on today's conversation, the extent to which you're doing some of these things, and also a space for you to kind of commit to what your next action might be coming out of this session. I suppose, yeah, going into your kind of closing remarks there from each of you, I was kind of thinking, what are my key takeaways? And it's this idea of everyone on the board being a finance trustee and having a role in the kind of interrogation of the financial position. This idea that the spectrum of options is only going to get smaller with time. And so having the conversations, being curious, exploring different models for impact regularly is really important, and kind of speaking about that openly rather than just kind of continuing with business as usual. We've heard it several times from all of our speakers, but kind of asking questions and asking questions early. But I think the thing I've added from all of your closing remarks there is kind of being mindful of the human side to some of this. It's very easy in a kind of session on achieving impact in a challenging financial context to get quite nuts and bolts of cash flow analysis and mergers and acquisitions or whatever it might be, and actually just thinking about the impact on the board, the people on your board, people in your staff team, and thinking about how you can support that as well is definitely one of my key takeaways, and I think something that came through really clearly, especially in your case study, Julie and Grant. So thank you for sharing that. Yes, this is, as I say, the final of these events for the year. So for those of you who've come to all four, huge thank you for your commitment to kind of improving your knowledge on governance issues, for exploring some of these more emergent issues for the sector. There were a couple of questions about specific training and resources on some of these things, and there's lots out there. These seminars are more about kind of exploring new and emergent issues for the sector, but there are great resources, and I'm including some of the ones that came out of the Getting on Board legacy that can help you to kind of improve your financial skill set and feel more confident in this area of governance. So we'll include a few resources from other organisations in the sector in the follow-up email. As I mentioned, if there are topics you would like future seminars about, or there's something on the horizon that you think it's really important that other trustees are thinking about, please do drop us an email after today's session or share in the chat your ideas for those, and we can try to build that into our programme for next year. Just a final reminder that when I close the call in a minute or two, a feedback survey will pop up. That's incredibly useful information for us in terms of understanding the value of our events and how we could better meet the needs of the sector. So please do take the minute or two it takes to fill that out, and that would be fantastic. I think that's all of my kind of wrap up and ending logistics covered. So I think the last thing to do is just to say, again, a huge thank you to the Clothworkers Company for funding this series, but more importantly, a huge thank you to our four speakers today who brought such a wealth of experience, of honesty, of openness to what's quite a challenging conversation, have really modelled that that kind of key takeaway of being open and asking these questions and having open dialogue about these issues and not letting it be unspoken. So thank you all so much for giving your time and expertise. I'm sure I'm not alone in taking a lot of value from the session. For those of you on the call, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you for another event soon. Bye.